Hello, so today we're going to be doing part 3 of our item guide series. So this is going to be talking about item pairing, item prioritization, as well as quote-unquote Bis items, which is just going to be me recommending different items that I think are good on some of the 4-cost units to kind of get yourself started if you're trying to figure out of complete item sets that you want to put on certain units. Now, if you do like my content, please make sure to like and subscribe. I do daily TFT content. I've been trying to focus on making some more guides, but typically we do a bunch of VOD reviews. And like I said, this is the part 3 of a series where part 1 we talked about item economy, and this was just a general item guide that talked about item mechanics. Part 2 we're talking about mostly diminishing returns, carry stacking, as well as introduction to mana generation, and now we're going to be talking about item pairings, prioritizations, and recommendations on certain units. So the first thing I just want to start over, we're going to be tying up some loose ends over the course of this series. So what I want to talk about a little bit was early game versus late game items. So some items, as much as you want to recommend items on certain units, as much as you think that items are good in certain situations, on certain units, or not on certain units, you have to also consider the items in context. Based on your early game versus your late game, whether the item actually has an effect on your early game or your late game can make a big impact on your placements in a game. So for example, the overarching really easy one to point out is something like Giant Slayer. Giant Slayer basically doesn't do that much. It gives you attack speed, AS, it gives you attack damage, and it gives you some AP, but its bonus effect of giving damage amp is pretty much useless for a lot of the early game because it only procs on units that have above 1700 HP. So early game, when there's not a lot of units that have a lot of HP, even like an unupgraded 4-cost, a lot of them don't even have 1700 HP if they're not like upgraded to 2-star or have like really good health items on them. So Giant Slayer, that's a type of item that you can look at, and you can say even if this item looks like it's really good on a certain unit, and you take diminishing returns, it gives damage amp, it gives attack speed, it might fill in the gap on your itemization. You have to know that when you slam it, if you don't slam it at an inopportune time, it's not as effective as if you slam it when it's more opportune, so to speak. So that's just something I want to introduce. If you think about early game options, a lot of times utility items, which we talked about a bunch, tank items, and Thieves Gloves, which we haven't talked about too much, but basically it's by putting 2 sparring gloves together. These are typically really strong early game. Thieves Gloves just gives a bunch of stats because you're getting like more value than just one item on a unit. Something like a Sunfire Cape is a really good tank item, but also has wounding when there's not a lot of, wounding and burning. So when there's not a lot of HP on the table in the first place in a lot of early game rounds, it's very easy to like whittle away the front line with something like anti-heal and wounding burning that you get from the utility of Sunfire. Additionally, just general tank items are good. I would like to say, like I do in most slides and most things in my guide, you want to make sure that if you're trying to tempo, if you're trying to like slam items early, you just want to try not to grief your components for late game. That's a lot of what we talked about in part 1 of this guide series. But additionally, don't like take these as like guaranteed all the time this works. You can slam backline items and streak. You don't need frontline items to streak. I'm just saying generally these are some strong early options. Shred and Sundering and other utility are also very good early game. Just anything that gives you a large damage boost could help you to streak on those early game fights. But these are just like the general rule of thumbs that I just want to introduce before we start talking about specific unit itemizations. So we talked about diminishing returns yesterday. Something that I left out is item pairs, because it's a really long topic that's going to take up part of this video. So item pairs usually comes with different items that can synergize really well with each other, and it doesn't necessarily break the rule of diminishing returns, but it kind of might seem a little bit unintuitive if you only take for face value what I was talking about yesterday. So a lot of times stacking effects or stacking the same items that are made with the same components becomes very important in certain situations. One example that's very common is crit. So if you want to have consistency in critical striking, a lot of times you want to pair up items that both use glove components. Why is that? If you make an item with a glove, it's always going to carry a little bit of crit chance with it. Now crit chance is what it is. It's a chance. It's a chance of having a critical strike. So if you make an Infinity Edge, for example, you're not guaranteeing that you're going to get a critical strike. So as much as you would want to not put like a lot of crit strike, a lot of crit chance on a unit, you have to have the crit chance to a certain point where you actually realize the critical strike. You know, if you have a unit that doesn't cast a bunch of times, then they won't be getting much value off the Infinity Edge in the first place, because if they don't cast a bunch of times and you have a very low critical strike chance, the chances are in a lot of fights you won't actually get the crit on your ult, and then you'll just lose the fight as is. So item pairs start to matter a lot in these type of situations, especially with crit chance. I'm going to go through an example right now, which is one that maybe you guys can think of: Jinx. So Jinx, here I have just the overview of Jinx. All these pictures where they have like the descriptions, out of laziness I just took them off of Meta TFT, but we give credit where credit's due. These pictures and these descriptions are from Meta TFT. So if you think about Jinx, she has a lot of damage. She is very, very strong as a late game unit. She's a 5-cost unit. She's obviously very strong. But if you read her ability, the way that it works is that she alternates between 3 different abilities that she has. She does a zap, then she has her chompers, and then she fires the rocket. Now the rocket is where most of her damage is, and it takes a while to get to the rocket, because not only does she actually have to cast in order to like use her ult or her like ability in TFT, you have to basically cycle 3 times or 2 times before that, and on the 3rd time she actually fires the rocket. So it takes an absurd amount of time a lot of the time. So it doesn't make sense to just put an Infinity Edge on her. Now she is Ambusher, so Infinity Edge is a little bit diminishing returns because the ability can already critically strike, but if you have an IE and Ambusher, then you just get extra critical strike. Like if your abilities can already critically strike, Infinity Edge has the bonus effect of giving you extra critical strike damage if you pair it. So it's not that bad to put IE on Jinx. It's an okay item to put on her, right? The problem is if you give her just an Infinity Edge and she fires a rocket, you have a very low critical strike chance. So there's a good chance that when she fires the rocket, you don't actually realize that critical hit. And it can actually sway the fight in a massive way, because if you want the rocket to do the maximum amount of damage. This is not a unit where she's auto-attacking a bunch, so she's getting like critical hit after critical hit, where it averages out over time and she's getting a lot of value off of a smaller critical strike chance. So what usually ends up happening is, the way to fix this is that you can basically just pair it with another item that has a glove component. So a Guard Breaker is a very good pairing with Infinity Edge. Guard Breaker works really well because Guard Breaker gives you a bunch of stats, additionally gives you a little bit more critical strike chance, and additionally it also gives you damage amp, which if we know from yesterday with diminishing returns, we first get a bunch of AD, we get a bunch of critical strike chance / damage, and then we also get damage amp. We're maximizing the amount of damage that this Jinx is going to do. Additionally, because you want her to cast as many times as possible, you can also build her with a mana item. Often you really want to put a Shojin on Jinx, so you'll do something like Infinity Edge Guard Breaker Shojin in order to make sure that she gets to that point of actually casting the rocket before the fight ends, and then once she casts it, she actually gets the critical hit on it. It's really, really important that you try and find pairings in these type of situations, especially with glove components, that you try and pair up Infinity Edge and Guard Breaker, or Infinity Edge and something else. Sometimes even in some type situations you make like a double IE if you have the opportunity. If you don't have the opportunity, you just try and put any other crit item on it. Yes, it seems a little bit goofy and it seems a little bit silly, but it's actually justified because you want to have the rock. If you're building for crit, that is, you want to have the rocket crit. Now you don't have to build Jinx with crit. I think better builds of Jinx, which we'll talk about tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to go through 5 costs. Today we're just going to go through 4 costs with itemizations. But if you're thinking about Jinx, a lot of times like damage amp works a lot better because she already gets a little bit of crit from Ambusher. So like, you know, you usually build her with like Giant Slayer, Guard Breaker, or like those type of items. But either way, the idea holds is that you want to try and ramp up that chance so that you actually get the critical hit. Just what I was saying before, just in case it wasn't clear, whenever you make an item out of 2 components, some of these guys are obviously for more beginner focused. So this might be something that you didn't notice or didn't see. It took me a little bit of time to notice this, obviously, when I first started playing. But basically, when you make an item, it's not just some magical new item. It still carries some of the stats of the components that it gives you. So basically, any item, like even a Steadfast Heart, where it's a frontline item, it has a little bit of critical strike chance because it's made with a glove component, right? The items are the sum of the components. So if you make an item that has a chainmail and a glove, it's going to have a bit of armor and a bit of crit strike chance because of the sparring glove that it was made with. Additionally, something like a Protector's Vow, for example, it gives you mana. So it gives you starting mana. It's not necessarily mana generation, but it gives you starting mana, which can help you to cast a little bit earlier on a frontline unit. So there's some frontline units that really want to cast. So if you give them a tier item, it will make them have their first cast a little bit sooner because it will give them more starting mana in order to get that first cast off. This is just something that's very important, and it's also important when you're trying to make your itemizations, because, for example, if you're making a tank and you put a steadfast heart on the tank, you might want to put something like a spark on the tank instead of something like you want to put like if you have a tank where you put a chainmail item which gives them armor. If you want to make them a really balanced tank, then you'll make a component that uses a cloak, because that will give them inherently a little bit of magic resist, and that's how you can kind of continue with that idea from yesterday of diminishing returns. So some common item pairs. These are just some common things that usually come up many times with different units. So for example, AS, right? It's not the same as crit chance, it's attack speed. But with attack speed, sometimes you want to pair an amount of starting attack speed with the attack speed generation. So for example, a lot of times when you're building an auto attacker build, so a unit that you just want to do a bunch of auto attacks and melt the opponent, a lot of times you'll make a Guinsoo, because like that's like the auto attacker build in TFT a lot of the time. And then you'll also try and pair it with another bow item. All the bow items give you a little bit of starting attack speed. So if you pair a Guinsoo with a Runans, for example, or Guinsoo's with a red buff, or Guinsoo's with the Last Whisper, these are things that have either different utility or different damage properties, but they all give you a bit of starting AS. Now, why is that important? If you start off with a little bit more attack speed, your Guinsoo will ramp up faster, because your first couple of auto attacks will go off faster. So then your Guinsoo will basically, it's like kickstarting the engine a little bit faster. So a lot of times when you see a Guinsoo on a unit, a lot of times another bow item really helps it out in order to actually realize the full potential of stacking that Guinsoo and getting to the point where you're actually melting the opponent. So that is one idea of item pairing. The other one that we talked about already was alt crit and crit chance. It comes in a lot of different forms. I use Guard Breaker because that's like a more max damage situation, but you can also use it with utility as well as different frontline and AP variations. So for example, you can go IE Last Whisper, which is a very good item pairing because it gives you attack speed, attack damage, and then it gives you a lot of crit strike chance, and it gives your abilities it gives your ult the ability to crit, and it also gives you utility in that it sunders your opponent, so it reduces their armor. So it's just a really strong pairing that a lot of times if you have these components, you usually build IE Last Whisper and put them on the same unit. Additionally, you have something like Guard Breaker IE, which instead of giving you like the extra utility, it gives you some damage amp. Additionally, if you're playing a frontline unit, a lot of times you'll do like a Hodge or a Hand of Justice with an IE. Hand of Justice gives you a bunch of frontline things like Omnivamp and damage. But additionally, it's a glove item, so it pairs really well with IE. If you're an AP frontline unit, you could put JG with Hodge, and then if you have JG with Guard Breaker for a backline unit, it does the same thing. You want to bring up that critical strike chance so that you actually get the critical strike hit on the ults, especially if you're not somebody who's doing a bunch of attacks where it averages out really well. If you're getting your cast off only a couple times per fight, you want to make sure that number is as high as possible for the crit strike chance to make sure that it actually happens, that your ult actually gets the crit off. Additionally, things like mana and attack speed pair off really well together. These aren't really necessarily like the same components that are being used, so it's not like item pairing in the same idea that the other ones are examples of, but Shojin Nashor is really good because you get a burst of attack speed when you cast. Shojin helps you to cast more, you generate mana, and you basically just chain cast. You get a bunch of casts off, so it works out really well a lot of the time. Now, we're going to introduce the next topic, which is item prioritization. So like I said, a lot of these are building on the ideas that we already learned, but item prioritization, basically the way you should think about it is that there's some units that really need certain types of items in order to function. And that's pretty obvious a lot of the time, but sometimes it's less obvious, especially if you're beginning or starting out in TFT. If you can control the build order of your items, then you should always consider this. It's not necessarily going to be the case, but it's like if I have the opportunity, for example, on a carousel to prioritize a certain item, then I should try to prioritize that item in order to make sure that my unit actually gets value later on. Because there's some things that are super valuable and there's some things that you have a lot of different options of. So for example, let's say we're talking about mages and casters. These are units where they need to cast their ultimate ability, or they need to cast their ability, their active, right? If they don't get a cast off, then they pretty much don't do that much in the fight. For example, like Heimerdinger, the more that Heimerdinger casts, the more rockets he gets, so he scales up his damage, and most of his damage is through those rockets. Silco, most of his damage is through his ult. He's not doing any damage with his auto attacks. Zoey as well is doing most of the damage with the ult, not with the auto attacks. Therefore, you really need to generate mana on these units, or else they just won't do any damage. Sometimes you can go into a late game scenario and not have a mana generation item. Specifically like Zoey, for example, we'll talk about a bit later. She really likes Gwinsu instead of a strictly mana item like Shojin, Adaptive, or Blue Buff, because she just gets so much starting attack speed from Rebels that it's actually more effective for her to just auto attack a bunch in order to generate her mana, so Gwinsu works out really well. Now, here I also put Adaptive Helm. Now, I know that in the past, I say that Adaptive Helm isn't the greatest of item slams, but when you think about item prioritization, if you cannot make a mana item, you still need a mana item on Heimer, you still need a mana item on Silco. It's very, very hard to play them without mana items unless your circumstances are very, very, very specific to like them actually being able to generate the mana with enough auto attacks on their own. So, Adaptive Helm, if you don't have the potential to do it, like if you don't have the option to make the other items, eventually you will probably have to make an Adaptive Helm on these units. And excuse me, that's just something that's very, very important to note. It's something that I want to clarify, because I always say don't make Adaptive Helm in the first part as well as in the second part. I kind of didn't talk about Adaptive Helm too much for mana generation. The reason is that it basically just gives mana every couple of seconds. So some units can use that really well, but most units cannot. Like for example, Zoey, because she takes so long to cast, she gets a lot of value off of Adaptive Helm. Especially if you give her like a Gwinsu with an Adaptive Helm, it actually works out pretty well on Zoey. But units like Silco and Heimerdinger, a lot of times you're just better off with a Shojin Nashor's build or a Blue Buff Nashor's build specifically for Heimerdinger. That being said, if you think about auto attackers, typically you're prioritizing making a bow item, so a Gwinsu or some other massive amount of attack speed, like a red buff that uses 2 bows. If you don't get them kickstarted with a bunch of auto attacks and you don't give them a bunch of attack speed, then they might not work out to be very, very strong later in the game. Additionally, if you're playing a melee user, sometimes you'll either need some sort of Omnivamp for survivability, or you'll need something like an Edge of Night where they de-aggro. For Mbessa, which we'll talk about a little bit later, having an Edge of Night is very, very important on the unit, because if you don't have an Edge of Night on Mbessa, she just dives into the backline, because Mbessa has the tendency to just jump through the frontline units. She just immediately gets bursted and she just dies. So you want her to be able to de-aggro, so she has that survivability of being able to dash around and ramp up and do a bunch of damage for you if she's your primary carry. So, additionally, this is another concept that we're going to talk about in the next video, but I want to introduce it here because it is something that comes into play when you're talking about what the best items are on a unit. We talked about before, talked about early game slams and leading up into this discussion. Here, when we're talking about item optimizations, you also have to make sure that you build for the fights, because the items themselves have to get value in the fight. A big example is Gwinsu not stacking. Gwinsu is really, I think it's really overplayed a lot of the time. I think it's like a very, very fun item because it has a little counter, and every time they auto attack, you see the number go up, and it's really, really fun. But a lot of times it doesn't get value late game because the fights just don't last that long. Additionally, if you don't have a good front line, Gwinsu just won't ramp up to an effect where it's actually meaningful. So a lot of times just having a general attack speed item, here I put red buff, but you can just stack bow items. For example, you can make like Runan's Guardbreaker, Giant Slayer, for example, and you can get so much attack speed just starting attack speed on the unit that it's more effective than Gwinsu in a lot of late game fights. That's something that you really have to consider and think about if you're trying to optimize, especially since you have so many removers. It's something you can do towards your late game in order to optimize your boards and squeak out like some extra placements a lot of the time. Obviously, like I said, we're going to talk more about this tomorrow. I want to split up. I was thinking this could be the last video, but then I once again have a very long presentation to do. So instead, I'm going to split it up, and tomorrow we're going to talk about 5 costs, 6 costs, as well as this concept. Now let's talk about Bis items for a second. So when I say we're going to talk about Bis items, we're really not going to talk about it. I'm just going to introduce what it is, and then I'm just going to shit on the idea of Bis items because I just don't agree with it at all. If you were coming here just to learn about Bis items, I don't care. Basically, what Bis stands for is best in slot. These change frequency, and a lot of these change frequently. And a lot of times, people get really baited by what the best items are for a particular unit because they go on some stat website or they watch some YouTube video and it says, "Hey, make these items for this unit, and you'll win every game." GG, clickbait, like and subscribe. I don't like to do that. If you watch my content regularly, you'll notice that I try and be as straightforward and as honest as possible. Everything that I do on this channel, it's with having done it many times before. If I post a VOD review or a guide and I say, hey, this item seems pretty good here, I do this for this reason, it's usually because I tried it out myself and I did a lot of work on it. And it's also like reasonable with the ideas of that I introduce in these ideas of item guides. And that's not to toot my own horn. I'm just saying you shouldn't, please don't be like this, right? It's cringe. Don't think you have to adapt to what you have, right? Don't hold out and think to yourself, okay, I just won't slam any items and then I have a guide that's going to give me my best items. You should always be trying to think critically about your spot. Think about, hey, does this item actually do something? Could I make an item pairing here that will work well on this unit? All the stuff that I'm trying to teach in these presentations that I'm doing with like these part 1, part 2 of items is to like the antithesis of this idea. It's mostly to say to yourself, hey, this is how you can figure out different ways to deal with your components and to make items, because that's a really, really important thing. If you look at a lot of top level players, anybody who's really good at the game, they never really like tunnel vision on making a particular set of items unless it's a very niche situation, right? Like Orn artifacts, for example. A lot of times it's like, okay, what can I make out of the components that I have this turn to make sure I'm as strong as possible this turn to save HP to actually get a top 4 placement. And that's a really, really important concept. So when I talk about items here, I want to make sure that I mention this because I don't want you to look at the next slides and be like, these are the items that I have to make all the time. GG, shake my hand, I win. It's more so like, hey, this is the framework that you can use, and then you can use that to learn, and hopefully you learn and you get better at TFT and you reach your goals and you're happy. So now we're going to go through, okay, just double side. Okay, so now we're going to go through forecast itemizations. These are arranged in alphabetical order because I probably won't have time to actually put the markers in the presentation. If I could, I will when I get a chance. So we're going to go through them in alphabetical order. So each slide, I'm basically going to say the name of the unit. I'm going to say what the prioritization is, so what I think is one of the most important items or items on the unit, and then I'm going to go through some recommendation. I'm going to explain each of them. So we're going to start with Mbessa. So Mbessa, prioritization, in my opinion, you always need an Edge of Night on this unit. She jumps through the front line. She jumps through the front line and into the back line. She dies so fast if you do not have a way to de-aggro. Edge of Night makes it so that at a certain HP threshold, she just gets stopped. People stop attacking her. And that's enough for her to regain Omnivamp and then to work out having a lot of damage. Now, in terms of recommended builds, I really like making Giant Slayer for late game. Obviously, I already talked about Giant Slayer not being good early game, but I really like Giant Slayer because he gives damage amp, he gives a lot of well-rounded stats, which Mbessa can use really well. And then something like a Bloodthirster because it gives her a health shield, so it gives her like double survivability, right? She can proc the health shield with Bloodthirster, and then she has the Edge of Night so that she doesn't get absolutely bursted if she dives the backline and gets into a bad spot. And then Giant Slayer gives her damage amp as well as a bunch of well-rounded stats, so she does a lot of damage in general. This is more of a build if you're playing her with Conquerors. If you're not playing with Conquerors and you're just trying to make her do like a maximum amount of damage as possible, then instead of Bloodthirster, you typically want to put a Hand of Justice on her, and instead of Giant Slayer, you typically want to put something like a Deathblade. She has really, really good AD scaling, so you want to make more AD focused items on her, but I still think Edge of Night is really important. Other recommendations, there's many, but basically you can go for like a full crit build, you can go for a full AD build, you can also go for some general tankiness with other frontline items, but you should just consider that like almost all frontline items are pretty good on her. Almost all melee items are pretty good on her. You just have to have a way of making her sustain herself and survive diving the front line. If she's not surviving after diving the front line, you either need more Omnivamp, an Edge of Night, or you need a significant amount of damage so that she actually scales up her Omnivamp, because Omnivamp is based on the amount of damage that you do. Corki. So Corki, in terms of prioritization, you want to make an Infinity Edge a lot of the time. Corki has this effect where he shoots the frontline unit and it reduces their armor, and he does a bunch of burst damage. But additionally, Corki also hits like the closest units within 2 hexes. So a lot of times Corki can actually snipe the backline, which is very, very, very important. A lot of times you'll be playing the game, and especially when it's like a late game situation, the Corki will just delete your unit. And it's really, really important that you have something like an IE, because it makes him very effective at like absolutely like destroying something. It's also why something like Gold Collector is really good on Corki, because if he snipes the backline, he can just execute them with Gold Collector. In terms of recommended builds, I usually like to pair the IE with another Crit Glove item. So I like giving him some attack speed, some damage amp in the form of red buff, Obviously that's a little bit high roll because you use a lot of bows, but IE with Last Whisper is really good. And then you can also make like a Giant Slayer for the same reason, get some damage amp. Guard Breaker is also good. I don't know what, I didn't put it here, but I put in the other recommendations. But you can also put Guard Breaker in place of that. But typically it's IE, Last Whisper, and then +1. He also has what's it called? He also has a scrap. So if you have scrap activated, a lot of times you can put a bow or a sword item, and then it will make it into the remainder item. Once you have like the crit glove item, which is really nice and really fun. Some other recommendations, like I said before, you can just go for more attack speed and just like hitting more units. So that's like utility Corki. This is usually if you're playing like Corki as a secondary carry. You can go for full crit, so QSS, even though it's like generally considered a frontline item, QSS gives a bunch of attack speed. So you get a bunch of attack speed with an item that's made with a crit glove. So you basically get 100% crit chance, or close to 100% crit chance, and a bunch of attack speed. Or you can just go for like a full absolute massive damage amp build, which is IE Guard Breaker, and then if you can make a Death Blade and you just absolutely melt units. But pretty flexible, but a lot of times you're just building around the idea of critting or doing a bunch of damage to backline with IE. Now, Dr. Mundo, we're not going to spend too much time on Mundo. I think Mundo is one of the most flexible tanks in the game. He scales really, really hard off of AP, which he gets from Dominator anyways. So usually you don't have to make AP items, and he scales off HP. So usually you want to prioritize some sort of belt item on him. In terms of recommendations, I usually just put like giga tank items on him. He has healing built in, so a lot of times I'll just put like Sunfire because he'll be like alive for a really long time, so he can just keep proccing Sunfire and delete units that way. And then a lot of armor and MR because he doesn't have armor and MR as a tank. But additionally, you can just build him with full HP and he'll just like out sustain a lot of the time, even without a lot of armor and MR. But either way, any tank build is probably good on Mundo. Whatever tank items you can make, just make sure that your tank items themselves don't interfere with each other and give each other diminishing returns that much. Ekko's a bit weird because Ekko's in a weird spot right now. If you're building for actual like Ekko as a main carry, I don't think that's something that's super viable right now. But in terms of what I would do, I usually like to just prioritize a Hodge or Hand of Justice. Ekko wants to crit because he has like the whole ambusher trait going for him. So stacking glove components seems really nice. So Hodge, JG, and Guard Breaker is a really cool idea. Additionally, you can also make Ekko to be more just like of a healing monster and just like heal as much as possible. So you can do something like Guard Breaker, Spark, and Hand of Justice. A lot of the builds for Ekko are really skewed by the fact that now you play him with Rebels. The max cap version of Rebels, a lot of times you play Ekko and Rumble because you get Scrap in, you get Ambusher in for Jinx, and then Ekko is just a frontline unit. Either way, other recommendations, you can just make like a melee build with the addition of Spark because he hits a lot of units, so you spread the value of Spark to those backline units a lot of the time. Or additionally, you can just build them with like more tank focused items like Crown Guard that scale off his AP really well, and like Sunfire, just utility in general if you're playing around Rebels. That you can have like really good tank items on Alawi, and then Ekko kind of serves as a secondary tank because with Scrap you get a huge Scrap shield, which works out really nicely. Elise. So with Elise, you usually want to prioritize some sort of mana item. Here I just put all the items that are frontline items that give mana. I think the most important one is probably Adaptive Helm on Elise, which actually works out really well because a lot of Elise lines that you play are like in sniper variation, so you can really easily get that Adaptive Helm on her. It also works if you want to make Elise as a backline carry. Adaptive Helm is pretty good as a backline item for Elise, but just be careful if you slam Adaptive Helm and you don't have Shred. You might run into situations in those particular cases. Now, you always want to have a mana item on Elise because Elise's ult is very, very important. She basically stuns a bunch of units and she has like a little jump effect when she stuns. So if you place her in front of an enemy carry, she can actually stun the enemy backline and just completely sway a fight one way or the other. And that's very, very important to note. So a lot of times if you think about Elise and she's going to be like your main tank and you want to get a lot of value off of her, you should try and think eventually getting some sort of tier frontline item on her. So in terms of recommendations, I really like Adaptive Helm on her. It generates mana. If you're in the front line, when you get hit by attacks, it generates extra mana. But you can also just build her with full tank. Any tank item, as long as you have like some sort of mana item, she gets a lot of value. If you don't have a mana item, then you just build her like a normal tank. That's totally fine as well and valid. It's just you get a lot more value if you get that first cast off. The biggest problem with Elise a lot of times is that she dies before she gets a cast off or before she gets more than one cast off. If you can build her for survivability as well as give her some sort of starting mana to guarantee a couple of casts, you can actually just completely win fights that you have no business winning. It's very, very important to know that. Garen. So Garen is Emissary, and his bonus is that he gives part of his HP. He gives like what I think they nerfed it to like 12 or something. He gives extra HP based on his base HP to the 2 units, one on his left and one on his right. Because of that, you usually want to prioritize HP items on him. There's really big jokes of like you just put like a bunch of Warmogs on Garen and you play him as like a bot for just like making your front line really tanky. The recommendations I have are obviously ones that use a lot of belt items or ones that use some sort of belt with passive healing. So Redemption and Dragon Claw both give some passive healing. Like it heals you based on your percentage HP every couple seconds. But if you're making him as your main tank, just think general tank items as well. Any tank items, as long as you have some sort of belt items to get a little bit of extra value from his emissary effect. If he's a secondary tank, then you just want to stack HP items on him and just make sure that your main tank is getting as much HP value as possible off of him. Heimerdinger. So prioritization is definitely a tier. Heimerdinger is a caster. Oops, sorry, I scrolled a little bit. Heimerdinger is a caster, so you want to make sure that he gets those casts off as much as possible. Recommended builds, if you're playing Heimer and you can make it, then his blue buff Nashor's Archangel is considered like the quote-unquote Bis. Shojin Nashor's Archangels is also pretty good. It's obviously a lot lower of a cap because you don't get as much value off of Shojin as you do off blue buff. But there's lots of other builds that also work out. The thing about Heimerdinger is that he's Academy, so a lot of times you get a lot more benefit of your items revolving around whatever the Academy items are. Even an Adaptive Helm is really good on Heimerdinger, but I'm sure that's usually with Academy builds, because if the Academy item is an Adaptive Helm, then you would just put that as the mana generation item on the Heimerdinger and you'll probably be okay. But typically attack speed and Academy items is really, really strong. Also, you can go for like a full damage Heimerdinger. A lot of times, if you make a Shojin, you typically sometimes move it on to like a Jace later. We'll talk about moving items onto 5 costs in tomorrow's video, but sometimes the items that are really good on a unit look a little bit weird because eventually you move those items over onto somebody else. You can also put anti-heal on him, like Morello gives attack speed as well as helps him really, really well in terms of casting a bunch. Because it gives attack speed and then it also has utility. And then if you're prioritizing items on Jace, then it makes a lot of sense to have some utility items on Heimerdinger instead. Alawi. So Alawi is really, really flexible. You just want to prioritize belt items on Alawi because she is a sentinel, so she gets a lot of value off. She doesn't get as much value off of armor and MR items. Now she does scale really well. She has like a damage scaling effect off armor and MR. So you could build armor and MR on her, but typically because she's a sentinel, she's going to have a bunch, so it's a little bit of diminishing return. So you want to make sure that you build some HP items, and that's why I say you should just prioritize belt. A lot of times I just put all my utility items on Alawi because especially if you're playing 6 Sentinel or even Rebel, she doesn't die anyways and she's gonna live a really long time. So you just keep your utility up as long as possible, and usually like she'll live no matter what until a Jinx Rocket. It's very rare that Alawi dies before the first Jinx Rocket. So like I'm talking about late game scenarios. She's really, really tanky. She's a really, really good tank. So I have a lot of faith in just putting utility items on her. Silco. So Silco, the prioritization is Shojin. Shojin is just his best item by far because you just need him to cast as much as possible. He's a caster and he does most of his damage through casting. The typical build is either Shojin Nashor's JG or Shojin Nashor's plus a damage amp item because he already gets a lot of AP. If he casts a bunch, Dominator gives a bunch of AP. A really new common build that you see is double Shojin because he gets so much. If you're playing like 6 Dominator, for example, if you give him double Shojin, he actually gets a lot of value off of his Dominator trait because every time you cast with Dominator, you get a bunch of AP. So double Shojin Nashor's is very, very strong, making a lot of attack speed with Shojin as well with damage amps. So Shojin red buff Giant Slayer or Shojin Giant Slayer Guard Breaker or anything that kind of scales up those other stats as well while still giving him attack speed also work really, really well. Attack speed works really well with Shojin to generate a bunch of casts, and then he scales up his AP anyways, so you don't want to put like Archangels or stuff like that typically on him. If you're going to go for those builds, you can just save those components and put them as other frontline or other unit items, and it works out a lot better often. Twitch is an auto attacker, so you prioritize attack speed almost always, so you want to have a Guinsoo on him. A lot of the builds with Twitch rely on you having a really stable and strong front line and then Twitch ramping up with Guinsoo. Some builds that are really, really common that I would recommend is something like Guinsoo, IE Last Whisper. IE Last Whisper, we already talked about it a bunch, is a really good item pairing. But if possible, you should just stack bow items on Twitch. I think Twitch works significantly better if you just forget about crit and you just build and stack starting AS. When Twitch starts to melt units, it's when he gets into that state of like absolutely like burning through them with the Guinsoo. And a lot of times when you're losing with Twitch, it's because he's just not burning through people. If you make IE Last Whisper, a lot of times you can late game move that onto a Caitlyn, which doesn't want to auto attack as much. She's more like a caster and she does like a lot of damage with ult. So moving those crit items onto a Jinx later, or sorry, a Caitlyn later is a lot more effective, and just building pure attack speed on Twitch is really good. But for like your early / mid game, it's really efficient to use some of those sword and glove items to make IE Last Whisper Guinsoo. You're not going to get dropped like 100 bows to make all of the bow items on Twitch, so you know, take it into account along the way. Another build that I really like, I think this is one that I want to try out a lot more, is making QSS IE and Guinsoo, because QSS IE has like the same synergy of like crit items with glove components, but QSS gives a bunch of starting attack speed, so it'll ramp up that Guinsoo a lot faster. So that's something I'm more inclined to make, but that's like a me thing. It's something that I kind of prefer, so I wouldn't worry too much about it if it looks weird to you. Vi's a little bit weird because you're usually itemizing her like lastly with a lot of like pit fighter reroll stuff, but typically you want to prioritize tanks and survivability. So because she has pit fighter in a lot of the time, you don't need omnivamp. Or you don't need any sort of healing. So a lot of times you're just going to build her for like really aggressive frontline damage and or survivability items. So something like a QSS, a Sterix, and a Titans just give her like tankiness and a lot of attack speed and uninterruptibility. Or you can swap out the QSS for an Edge of Night to make sure she doesn't just die instantly if she jumps the back line. Additionally, if you don't have pit fighter, you can go healing. You can go full crit build where you go Hodge, IE, and then some sort of survivability item. Additionally, something that I really like on her, I tried this out once or twice, is putting a mana item on her, like something like a protector's vow, for example, because you want her to be as a frontline unit to kind of tank a little bit. And in certain builds, especially with Emissary, if you're playing around Mbessa and Corki as like your main damage, or sorry, Mbessa as your main damage dealer, and you're playing Vi with that type of build, a lot of times Vi needs to frontline a little bit because the Garen isn't enough as a frontline unit, and you don't want the Mbessa to just get melted because the Vi died too fast. So I really like something like Protector's Vow. It helps her to get her stun off. The stun basically just like can sway the fight, similar to Elise. So you get that starting first cast stun. She also stays in the front line for a while. She gets some extra survivability because she just, instead of prioritizing damage with her, you're prioritizing tankiness. And it can synergize really well in a lot of builds. So I wouldn't sleep on putting a mana item on Vi. I think it's actually really good. And finally we get to Zoey. So Zoey is weird, which we're going to talk about a lot in the next video. But Zoey, a lot of times you're prioritizing Guinsoo on Zoey. Now Zoey is a caster, but her mana threshold is so high, and she has so much attack speed from Rebel, that a lot of people are really favoring putting Guinsoo on Zoey instead of like typical other builds. Now I'm not saying that the other builds are not that good, they're very average. A lot of times it's a lot better if you just build her with a Guinsoo. So for example, Guinsoo with full crit, or Guinsoo with damage amp and Shojin, just to make sure that she casts a bunch of attack speed, and she just like chain casts. Because Guinsoo's Shojin will just generate so much mana for her. She's also really strong with Adaptive Helm. But like I said, you shouldn't necessarily make Adaptive Helm and play towards Zoey unless you have a very clear spot for it. So for example, if you have a Rebel emblem and you know for sure that you're playing Zoey, you might be more inclined to say, okay, this is a spot where I have to hit Zoey, make or break, so I will make Adaptive Helm and all of these items. A lot of times when you're playing around Rebel as well, Shred might not matter as much. So Adaptive Helm actually works out really well on Zoey, because your max cap for Rebel is hitting a Jinx. If you don't hit the Jinx and you don't have the Jinx rocket late game, then you run into some serious problems a lot of the time anyways, because Zoey is a little bit slow in getting the damage out. Additionally, with other Rex, there's just the typical Shojin Nashor's +1 build. Shojin Nashor's JG, Shojin Nashor's Archangels, Shojin Nashor's like anything else. Those are also still valid. The reason they're valid is because late game you can actually move the items over to Jinx. You like I said before, Jinx you want the rocket to cast a lot of times. So if you're playing Zoey, you're typically going to be playing towards Jinx, so you can make a Shojin and then you can move it to Jinx later. And that's like a really big idea, and it's something that I've been mentioning a lot in this video. I just didn't want to make this video too long, but it's something we're going to talk about in tomorrow's final part. Tomorrow is actually going to be the final part. Because I decided, I wrote it out, it's scripted, it's ready, it's going to be the 5 and 6 cost overview, so I'm going to do the same thing I just did right now, because I'm going to talk about 5 and 6 costs, and then we're going to talk about late game item pivots, ways to optimize the board. So for a lot of the common boards, like, for example, we were talking about Jinx a lot. For example, with Heimerdinger and Jace, we can talk about a little bit. I'm going to talk about like, hey, these are some goals that you can have if you have this type of unit like Twitch or Jinx or Jace, or like, you know, you're trying to play around a 5 cost when you already have a 4 cost that's itemized. These are some things you can do to shuffle your items in order to make it work out in your late game and kind of optimize towards that late game builds. So without much ado, thank you for watching. Hopefully that was enjoyable, and yeah, join me for part 4 hopefully tomorrow. Tomorrow's Christmas. I'm gonna put a little Christmas hat on my little dude. I didn't get a chance to do it today, but I'm gonna do it for tomorrow. Make sure to like and subscribe if you do like my content, and yeah, have a great day and have a happy holidays, or however you celebrate your little break, because it's gonna be, you know, by the time this video is up, it's probably gonna be the 25th already, so that's really nice. See you guys. Bye bye.